You ever notice how there are certain trends that come and then they go and then they come right back again? You know, I have to admit, I'm standing in the checkout line of a grocery store or whatnot, and I see some fashion magazines there, and I look at the people on the front cover, and I go, I wore that in high school. You notice that? It's like, now, the bell-bottoms are coming back, and the kind of flowery paisley shirts are coming back, and the hairstyles are coming back, and the military. We used to go to the Army Navy surplus store to buy some really cool clothes to wear, and now that military look is starting to come back in fashion again. It's just interesting how it goes. If you hang on to your stuff long enough, eventually it becomes cool again. Fashions come and they go, and they have a weird way of coming back again, just in a slightly new way. Well, what's true in the fashion world is also true in the spiritual world. There's a spiritual cycle that keeps happening again and again and again. There are phases in this spiritual cycle that come, stay, and go, only to come back again. We could call this a spiritual development cycle. It applies to every person. It applies to every church. This particular cycle is inevitable and inescapable. If we are familiar with the spiritual development cycle, we will be able to rightly interpret what is happening in our lives. If we're familiar with the spiritual development cycle, we will actually be able to anticipate what is going to come next in our lives. It has that kind of power. If we're unfamiliar with the spiritual development cycle, then we will often live confused as to what in the world is happening in our lives. We will be thinking that things are going wrong when actually everything is going according to plan. If we're unfamiliar with the cycle, we can get disillusioned with God. We can become disappointed in God. We can actually become angry at God if we don't understand the cycle. Because this cycle is how God has chosen to work in our world. How He has chosen to work in our lives. How He has chosen to work in our church. And knowing that cycle is a huge advantage in interpreting what's happening in our lives and knowing what's coming next. So we can be prepared rather than caught off guard. So we can get what God is doing rather than being all confused and bent out of shape. Would you like to know what the cycle is? You'd like to know what it is? In order for us to find out this cycle, this way God operates, the inevitable phases that cycle into our lives and cycle back out only to come again, in order to learn it, we have to go retro. We have to go all the way back some 2,000 years to the first set of Christians and the first Christian church. Their history is recorded in the book of Acts. And when we look at the first 8 chapters of the book of Acts, and we look at it from a lot of altitude, if we don't get caught up in the details, as good as the details are, we can discern this spiritual development cycle. We can see the phases these early followers of Jesus went through that turns out to be repeated again and again and again in Christians' lives and Christian churches for 2,000 years ever since. Here's how that cycle works. First of all, there is what we will call a birthing. This is when God starts something new in your life. In Acts chapters 1 and 2, we find God birthing something. He started something brand new. It was called the church. He took His people, He infused His Spirit into them in a permanent way to give them a unique kind of spiritual power, and then He called them to a whole new level of living. That a whole different kind of impact on the world. The first phase in the spiritual development cycle is the birthing, God starting something new in you or in His church. The second cycle we'll call growing. When we embrace what God is birthing in us and we begin to live it out, we experience that new level of life that God intended. We experience a greater measure of inner transformation. We experience a greater level of impact on other people. We grow, we experience the promise of the better life that came when God tried to birth something inside of us. The third step in this cycle, the third phase in it, is what we'll call persevering. Inevitably, after God has birthed something in us, and we've embraced it and live it out, and our life has changed, and our impact has changed, and we experience a whole new level of living, things will arise to get you to quit. You will face opposition that is intended to derail what is going on in your life. That opposition may come from outside, as in persecution or trials, or it might come from inside. In Acts chapter 4 and 5, we find the early followers of Jesus suddenly having to persevere as it became more and more difficult to live out what God had birthed in. It's inevitable. Opposition will come. The fourth phase in this cycle we will call restructuring. In restructuring, what we do is we learn how to rearrange our lives in order to accommodate the new person we have become. We learn how to take the growth that God has given and alter our lives so that it is sustainable over the long haul. It is in the restructuring phase of the spiritual development cycle that we arrange our lives so that what God has done becomes permanent and lasting. In Acts chapter 6, we find this restructuring phase, where what the church had to do was to go, with all the growth we have, there are certain things not being done. We need to restructure the way we go about our lives so that we can maintain the growth that God has given. Restructuring. And then the last phase we're going to call stimulating. What God does here, after He births something, and we've grown and embraced it, and it's so cool, but then the opposition comes, and so we learn to persevere. As we persevere, even greater blessing comes, but now we've got to manage the growth that's happened in our lives, so we have to restructure the way we do life. Right here would be an easy place to just kind of kick back and go, cool. But what God does is He begins to prepare us for the next thing He wants to birth in our lives. So He begins to stir things up in our spirit, or He begins to stir things up in our world. He begins to prepare the soil so that He might birth something new again in our lives. We find this happening in Acts chapter 8, where a persecution broke out that drove all of the early disciples out of Jerusalem and scattered them throughout the world because God was going to birth something new again. So we find in the book of Acts, in chapters 1 and 2, a birthing of something new. In chapters 2 and 3, the growing of that new thing. In chapters 4 and 5, having to persevere against opposition to keep that new thing going. In chapter 6, a reordering of life to maintain the growth that has been given. And then in chapters 8, we find the stimulating in God preparing for the next new thing He wanted to birth in their lives. Now mark it down. When you go into chapter 9 in the book of Acts and start reading, you will find, if you look at it from some altitude, the exact same cycle repeating itself again.